Warning: extremely disturbing material concerning grooming, CSA, coercion and peril are discussed. Andrew knew the laws about consent existed precisely because children couldn't be expected to carry the responsibility for those boundaries. Andrew also understood why Tate's perception changed so dramatically after the second attack. That incident had been brutal. It finally fit Tate's internal definition of what a rapist was: someone who overpowered him, intentionally hurt him, frightened him, forced their sexual attentions on him, and treated his body as something they had the right to control. Before that, Tate had kept Jay in a completely different category. That didn't make the earlier relationship healthy. It didn't make it consensual in the legal sense. And it certainly didn't erase the harm. It explained something about Tate instead. He had grown up in an environment so distorted that he needed physical violence before he could recognize a relationship as predatory. Andrew found that profoundly tragic. Tate had learned to measure danger by how badly someone hurt him. If a person frightened him, held him down, threatened him, or deliberately injured him, Tate understood he or she was a monster. If someone showed affection, protected him, and allowed Tate to believe he was choosing the relationship, Tate struggled to recognize the individual as a predator or see the grooming as the violation of the boundary itself. That wasn't because Tate was incapable of understanding right and wrong. It was because nobody had taught him what healthy boundaries looked like. In Tate Blue's family, there were no boundaries, there were no lines that were crossed, there simply were no lines. The Blue family loved on each other too much physically and not in the way families were supposed to. They hugged too long, touched too often, sat too close, and were constantly wrapped around one another. Physical affection was everywhere, so constant that nobody stopped to question where affection ended and personal space began. To the Blue family, it was simply love. There was no hesitation before touching someone, no thought that perhaps someone might want space, no understanding that even within a loving family, a person still had ownership over their own body and the right to decide when they wanted to be touched. Tate had grown up surrounded by that kind of affection. He had never been taught that love could be gentle without being intrusive. He had never been taught that someone could love you deeply and still not want to be touched. Nobody had explained that affection required consent, even between people who loved each other. There simply were no lines. And Tate had never learned to see the lines because nobody in the Blue family had ever taught him that they were supposed to exist. The Blue family showed love and affection by waiting until the lights went off when it got dark and slipping into each other's bedrooms, consensual or not. Tate wasn't afraid of the dark. Andrew knew it was what the men and women in his family did in the darkness without Talia knowing about it that terrified the fuck out of the boy. The darkness itself had never been the problem. Tate could sit in a completely dark room and feel nothing. He could walk through a dark hallway without flinching. He wasn't afraid of shadows, silence, or the absence of light. He was afraid of what happened when the lights went out. Andrew knew that Tate had learned to associate darkness with secrets, closed doors, whispered voices, and people entering bedrooms when they shouldn't have. It was the uncertainty that had frightened him, the knowledge that things were happening around him that he didn't understand and that the adults had deliberately kept hidden from Talia. The Blue family had treated this behavior as affection, as something normal, something that simply happened behind closed doors. But Andrew knew better. For Tate, the darkness had never been frightening because it was dark. It was frightening because the darkness was when the rules disappeared. And there were already so few rules in the Blue family to begin with. Andrew realized that Tate's eventual recognition of Jay was therefore not simply a change in how he remembered the past. It was evidence that Tate had finally developed a framework for understanding something he hadn't been capable of understanding as a child. A relationship can feel loving to a child and still be abusive. And no amount of affection, attachment, or perceived mutuality could change that. What surprised Andrew most was that even after the second attack, the one in which Jay brutally assaulted Tate, sodomized him, and left him physically and psychologically devastated, Tate still loved him. That was the part Andrew struggled to comprehend. Tate didn't come away from the assault thinking, Jay is a monster. He came away thinking, I did this. Tate believed he had led Jay on for years. He believed he had betrayed him by falling in love with Noah. He believed that by refusing to give Jay what he wanted, by choosing someone else and by allowing Jay to become jealous, he had somehow caused the violence that followed. Andrew knew that was not how responsibility worked. The law didn't make an exception for jealousy. It didn't make an exception for heartbreak. It didn't make an exception because someone had said cruel things, flirted, withdrawn affection, or deliberately made another person jealous. Unless someone was acting in legitimate self-defense, none of those things gave another person the legal right to attack them. And certainly nothing Tate had done gave Jay the right to threaten him, threaten Noah, or use Noah's safety as leverage. If Jay told Tate in effect to tell the truth to Noah or have sex with me, that wasn't consent. It was coercion. Regardless of their ages, their backgrounds, or what the law said, there was never a time, a place, or a period of Tate's life with Jay that Andrew could look back on and call legal. Even if they had both been adults, the power imbalance would still have mattered. When one person has control over another person, when fear, dependence, threats, authority, or coercion make saying no impossible, age alone doesn't make that relationship appropriate. Andrew understood that legality and morality were not the same thing. Something could technically fall outside a particular criminal statute and still be coercive, exploitative, and profoundly wrong. An adult could still be controlled. An adult could still be afraid. An adult could still be unable to freely consent. Tate hadn't simply needed someone to tell him that certain relationships were illegal. He needed someone to teach him what genuine freedom looked like. He needed to understand that love meant having the ability to say no, to walk away, to have privacy, and to remain his own person. The disturbing part of Andrew's realization was that Tate sleeping with his godfather was, in some ways, the least disturbing part of the entire situation. There was a whole different depth of disturbing underneath it, one that Andrew didn't even want to think about. Having an illicit relationship with your godfather was deeply inappropriate. But the dynamics between Jay and Tate went much darker than that. Jay had absolute financial control over Tate. He was Tate's power of attorney until Tate turned 22, and he was positioned to inherit the entire estate, whatever hadn't already been given to him before Terrence died. That created an enormous power imbalance between Jay and Tate. Andrew knew that money could be power, legal authority could be power, control over someone's access to their own resources could be power. And when all of those things were concentrated in one person, the relationship stopped being something Andrew could look at as simply an inappropriate romantic relationship. The godfather relationship was disturbing. The power was worse. Because Tate wasn't simply involved with an older man who happened to be his godfather. Jay held enormous authority over his life, his finances, and his future. That meant the question wasn't merely whether Tate had feelings for Jay. The question was whether Tate had ever been truly free to have feelings separate from Jay's influence. Andrew found that question far more disturbing than the relationship itself. Being in an intimate, romantic relationship with your godfather was the least horrific part of Jay and Tate's relationship. The real horror was the possibility that Tate had been taught to mistake dependence for love, obedience for consent, and control for protection. A person who agrees to sex because they are afraid of what will happen if they refuse isn't freely consenting. Andrew knew that distinction was fundamental. Tate didn't. At least not emotionally. Intellectually, he could eventually repeat the words, but emotionally, he couldn't accept them. Because accepting them meant accepting something far more painful. Jay had raped him. The man Tate had once loved. The man Tate had once considered his protector. The man Tate had once thought of as an ex-lover and fiancé. That was where Tate's cognitive dissonance became almost unbearable. He could call Jay names. He could tell Noah that Jay was horrible. He could rage about what Jay had done. But beneath all of that anger, Tate still loved him. And that love made the truth almost impossible to acknowledge. Jay had coerced Tate into sex so the older man wouldn't brutalize Noah. Tate believed he consented to taboo sex to protect Noah's body and innocent point of view of his life. Tate couldn't live with the knowledge that he let Jay touch him after realizing 12 years earlier what his relationship with his ex-fiancée really was. Tate allowing himself to lie with a monster like Jay made Tate want to kill himself after the event occurred. Andrew suspected Tate had spent years trying to preserve two incompatible realities at the same time. In one reality, Jay was the person Tate had loved. In the other, Jay was the person who had raped and brutalized him. Tate desperately wanted the first reality to remain true because if it remained true, then perhaps the second reality didn't have to be. If Jay had been a monster all along, Tate could have hated him. But if Jay had loved him, if Tate had genuinely loved Jay, then what did that make the violence? Tate couldn't find an answer that didn't destroy something inside him. So he blamed himself. He told himself that he had been cruel. That he had provoked Jay. That he had betrayed him. That Noah had come between them. That perhaps Jay's jealousy had been understandable. Andrew knew none of that was true. But trauma doesn't always follow logic. Sometimes the victim would rather believe I caused this than accept the more terrifying reality. Someone I loved chose to hurt me. Because if Tate had caused it, then perhaps he could have prevented it. Perhaps he could have behaved differently. Perhaps he could have been more faithful. Perhaps he could have said the right thing. Perhaps he could have saved himself. But if Jay had simply chosen to hurt him, then Tate had to confront the fact that love had never made him safe. And that was Tate's deepest fear. Not merely being assaulted. Not merely being raped. Being brutalized by someone he loved. That possibility terrified him more than almost anything else. Andrew thought that explained why Tate had spent so many years repressing what he actually felt about the assault. He didn't want to call himself a victim. He didn't want to think of Jay as a rapist. He didn't want to admit that someone he had loved had committed a horrific act against him. And he especially didn't want to accept that his love for Jay could coexist with what Jay had done. But those things could coexist. Tate could have loved Jay. Jay could have been someone Tate once trusted. And Jay could still have raped him. The love did not erase the crime. The crime did not retroactively erase Tate's feelings. That was the unbearable truth Andrew wished Tate could understand. Tate didn't have to hate Jay to admit what happened. He didn't have to pretend the relationship had never mattered. He didn't have to deny that there had been affection, attachment, or genuine emotional intimacy. He only had to stop taking responsibility for someone else's violence. Andrew knew that might take years. Perhaps decades. Because Tate's entire understanding of love had been constructed around protection, loyalty, fear, and survival. And Jay had taken the person Tate loved most deeply and turned that love into a weapon against him. That was why Tate couldn't simply walk away emotionally. He wasn't grieving an ordinary breakup. He was grieving a person he had loved while simultaneously trying to comprehend that the same person had violated him. For more than a decade, Tate carried that contradiction inside himself. He could say Jay was cruel. He could say Jay was dangerous. He could say terrible things about him to Noah. But somewhere underneath the anger, the love remained. And perhaps that was the saddest part. Tate didn't want to believe he had been raped by the man he loved. Because accepting that meant admitting something even more frightening. The person he had trusted with his heart had become the person who hurt him most. When Tate was 8 until he went off to Brown, he became more attached to Noah than his ex-fiancée and long-term lover. Tate simply loved Noah more, and Tate refused to comply with his lover's demands to cut Noah off forever while prioritizing the blonde's presence over his lover's comfort. This made Tate's lover angry and jealous. The truth was more complicated. More frightening. Jay's relationship with Tate and the warm companionship of Noe and Tay threatened to expose the hidden architecture underneath Tate's entire existence. Because if someone became truly central to Tate emotionally, eventually they would notice the distortion. The strange gravitational pull Noah exerted over Tate's psyche. The way every road emotionally curved back toward Noah somehow. The way Tate organized his life around Noah without openly acknowledging that he was doing it. The way Tate could sleep beside other people and still emotionally orient himself around Noah like a compass needle finding north. Everyone Noah knew, including Noah himself, believed the same story. They believed that Tate had met Noah by pure chance in preschool, that two little boys had simply gravitated toward one another and formed an inseparable bond that no one could have predicted. It was a comforting story, one repeated so often that it became accepted as fact. Their relationship and everything that followed was treated as a happy accident, a coincidence that changed both of their lives forever. Tate knew otherwise. In his mind, their first meeting had never been accidental but the result of a desperate plan conceived by the person he considered his fiancée and first love. The idea had been simple in its heartbreaking logic. If Tate could find an exceptionally kind, trusting child and keep that child constantly at his side, he would never be completely alone with the relatives he feared. A permanent companion would be another pair of eyes, another witness whose presence might discourage familial abuse simply because someone else was there to see it. Noah, with his open heart and innocent nature, became that child. He never realized the role he had unknowingly filled, believing instead that he and Tate had become friends by fate. The foundation of their relationship, as Tate understood it, rested on a secret he could never reveal. To explain why he had sought Noah out in the first place would mean exposing the terrifying reasons behind it, and it would force Tate to tell Noah about the fiancée whose plan had set everything in motion, a truth Tate believed would shatter everything Noah thought he knew about the beginning of their lives together. This, in Tate's mind, was the reason Noah survived. Other people wondered why Tate's mysterious lover, the man some believed had become an obsessive stalker, had never tried to harm Noah for standing between them. They assumed Noah was an obstacle. They assumed jealousy would have made him the first target. They could not have been more mistaken. The truth, as Tate understood it, was that his fiancée believed he owed Noah a debt that could never be repaid. Unable to remain in California to watch over Tate every hour of every day, he had entrusted that role to someone else without Noah ever realizing it. For years, Noah unknowingly became Tate's constant companion, his protector, and the reassuring presence that allowed Tate to endure a home he experienced as frightening. Rather than resenting Noah, Tate's fiancée came to see the blonde with profound gratitude. Over time, that gratitude grew into quiet paternal affection. Noah was no longer merely the young man who stood beside the person he loved. He became someone the fiancé cared for in his own right. In his eyes, Noah had spent years protecting Tate without ever asking for recognition. And for that reason alone, he could never bring himself to harm the one person who had faithfully guarded the man they both loved. What Noah never knew was that the man who had convinced Tate, years earlier, to find a constant companion in preschool, a child whose presence might help protect him from the family Tate feared, was the very person Noah trusted most. Noah had no idea that Tate even had a fiancée and first love, let alone that this unseen figure had quietly orchestrated the circumstances that brought the two boys together. To Noah, their meeting had always seemed like fate. To Tate, it had been a carefully conceived plan born of fear and the hope that one loyal friend could become a shield against the dangers he believed surrounded him. The cruel irony was that Noah often turned to this man for guidance, reassurance, and advice without ever suspecting the hidden role he had played in his own life. The person Noah admired and confided in was, in Tate's eyes, the architect of the relationship Noah treasured most. That same secret was also the reason Tate believed he could never return Noah's unrequited feelings. In Tate's mind, his heart had long since been given to the man who had first protected him and ultimately set him on the path that led him to Noah. Revealing the truth, Tate feared, would not only expose the hidden origins of their friendship but would also shatter everything Noah believed about how and why their lives had become forever intertwined. Tate's fiancée had given him one simple instruction: find someone before it was too late. Find a kind, loyal child who would stay beside him until he was old enough to leave for college. A constant companion, a witness, a bodyguard whose very presence might discourage the people Tate feared from hurting him whenever they were alone together. It was never meant to become anything more than a means of survival. When Tate met Noah in preschool, he believed he had found exactly what his fiancée had described: a gentle blonde boy whose unwavering loyalty would help him endure the years until he could finally escape. In Tate's mind, Noah was the greatest gift his fiancée had ever given him, even though Noah himself never knew the role he had been asked to play. Neither Tate nor his fiancée anticipated what happened next. As the years passed, Noah stopped being merely Tate's protector and became the center of his world. Tate gradually fell in love with the very boy who had entered his life as a safeguard, while Noah remained blissfully unaware of the hidden purpose behind their friendship. When Tate's fiancée finally realized what had happened, he found himself consumed by jealousy he never intended to feel. It was not Noah's fault. The blonde boy was completely innocent, never knowing he had become part of an emotional triangle that had existed long before he understood it. He believed their friendship had been born by chance, never suspecting that it had begun as a carefully conceived plan, or that the love growing quietly in Tate's heart threatened to change all three of their lives forever. What was the fiancé supposed to do? In his mind, every possible choice carried consequences. He could not hurt Noah, not after everything Noah had done for Tate. The blonde boy had spent years protecting the person he loved most, even without understanding that was what he was doing. Noah had been there during Tate's most vulnerable moments, had offered him comfort when no one else could, and had become someone Tate's fiancée could never view as an enemy. More than that, he knew Tate cared deeply about Noah. If he ever harmed Noah, he would not just lose Noah's trust, he would lose Tate forever. So he chose another path. He became Noah's friend. He offered advice, listened to his worries, and slowly built a relationship with the very person who stood between him and the person he loved. But beneath the friendship was a quiet attempt to create distance between Tate and Noah. Instead of revealing the truth, he carefully controlled what Noah knew. He never explained why Tate struggled with emotional closeness, why he avoided certain kinds of touch, why affection could overwhelm him, or why Tate seemed unable to return Noah's feelings in the way Noah desperately wanted. The fiancé knew the missing pieces of Tate's story. He knew the reasons behind Tate's fear, his walls, his arrested development, and his inability to fully surrender himself to another person. But telling Noah the truth would mean exposing secrets Tate had spent years hiding. So he chose silence and allowed Noah to believe the distance was rejection rather than the result of wounds he did not understand. For a time, it almost worked. The carefully placed doubts, the unanswered questions, and the emotional distance slowly created a space between Tate and Noah. The fiancé never saw Noah as someone to destroy. He saw him as someone who had become too important to remove. That was the impossible contradiction. Noah was the person he needed to separate from Tate, but also the person he could never bring himself to harm because Noah had saved the person they both loved. Noah had never been Tate's first protector. Long before Noah entered his life, Tate's fiancée had been the person who stood between Tate and the dangers he feared. He had been the shield, the person who stepped in when Tate needed someone stronger beside him, the barrier that made Tate feel less alone. But eventually circumstances changed. Education, distance, and an ocean between them meant the fiancé could no longer be physically present every day. He could not be there for every morning, every night, every moment Tate needed someone. So he relied on the one person he believed could fill that role, Noah. At first, the arrangement had seemed temporary. Noah was supposed to be someone who kept Tate company, someone whose presence gave Tate security until the day Tate could escape the environment that frightened him. But the fiancé never expected Noah to become so important. He never expected Noah to become the person Tate reached for first, the person who knew his moods, his fears, and his silence better than anyone else. Slowly, the role of protector became something much deeper. Fiancé began noticing the small things that revealed how much space Noah occupied in Tate's life. Their usual private moments were no longer private because Noah was always there. Conversations that once belonged only to them were interrupted by Noah answering the phone. Plans that once belonged to two people became three. Whenever the fiancé tried to have Tate alone, Noah seemed to be part of the moment, not because Noah was trying to interfere, but because Tate had grown dependent on his presence. The hardest realization came when the fiancé understood that Noah was no longer just someone protecting Tate from the outside world. Noah had become Tate's safe place. After Tate ended their relationship at 13, the fiancé struggled to understand what had replaced him. Eventually, he realized the answer was Noah. Tate had not simply found a buddy, he had unconsciously built another wall between himself and everything that caused him fear, including the people from his past and even the fiancé who once promised to protect him. The jealousy was painful because Noah had never intended to take anyone's place. The blonde boy did not know the history, the promises, or the complicated bond that existed before him. Noah only knew that Tate needed him and he stayed. That was what made the situation impossible. The fiancé could resent Noah's closeness to Tate, but he could never truly hate him. Noah was the person who had protected Tate when he could not. The same person who stood between them was also the reason Tate had survived long enough for them all to still be connected. When Tate turned 13, everything changed. He ended his relationship with his fiancée, but he never truly let go of the protection and security that relationship had provided. For the next 2 years, Tate relied on Noah in a way Noah never fully understood. The blonde boy became a living barrier between Tate and the person who once knew him better than anyone. Noah was not trying to take anyone's place, and he did not even know he was standing in the middle of something much larger than friendship. He simply stayed beside Tate because the blue air needed him there. The fiancé initially believed Tate's explanation that he needed time, that he was confused, that Tate was not ready, that he needed space to figure out what he wanted. He waited, believing there was still a chance they would find their way back to each other. But eventually he began noticing the pattern. Every time he tried to reconnect with Tate, Noah was there. Every time he tried to have a private conversation, Tate found a reason not to be alone with him. Slowly, the fiancé realized that Tate was not simply taking time to decide about their relationship. Tate had found someone else to stand between them. The realization devastated him. The person who had once been Tate's protector now felt replaced by the very person he had helped bring into Tate's life. He knew Noah was innocent, but jealousy overwhelmed him. Noah had become the person Tate trusted, the person who shared his daily life, and the person Tate reached for when he needed comfort. The fiancé felt as though he had unknowingly created the bond that was pushing him away. Unable to confront the complicated truth directly, he put his feelings into a letter. It was filled with hurt, jealousy, and the pain of realizing that the relationship he thought he was protecting had changed forever. Years later, that letter was discovered by Chloe, revealing a piece of a history that Tate had tried desperately to keep hidden. Andrew exhaled slowly. Noah was not the secret itself. He was evidence of the secret. A mirror reflecting something Tate could never safely articulate directly. And Tate spent years desperately making sure nobody looked long enough into that mirror to understand what they were actually seeing. That was why the lovers mattered. Not because Tate loved any of them or even cared about those lucky enough to share a bed for an hour, but because they prevented anyone from asking the dangerous question: why does Noah remain emotionally irreplaceable no matter who else enters Tate's life? Andrew thought back over years of observations. Every breakup, every spiral, every emotional collapse, every dissociative episode. Almost all of them occurred when someone unknowingly challenged Noah's position inside Tate's emotional world. Not publicly, structurally. And Tate reacted not with ordinary heartbreak, but with fragmentation. Like reality itself was destabilizing around him. At the time, Andrew thought Tate suffered from pathological dependency. Now he understood the dependency was only the visible symptom. The real issue was that Noah occupied a psychological position connected to truths Tate's mind could barely tolerate consciously. Which meant replacing Noah emotionally was impossible because Noah's role had never actually been romantic in the ordinary sense to begin with. Noah symbolized continuity, memory, protection, loss, love, guilt, survival, peace, stability, fun, calmness, safety. The part of Tate that still believed innocence could exist if Noah remained untouched. Andrew shut his eyes briefly. That was why Tate could endure casual lovers indefinitely while collapsing emotionally whenever Noah's permanence approached. Permanent intimacy threatened exposure. Because eventually any truly close partner would realize, no matter how little attention Tate gave others, some deeper part of him always remained turned toward Noah. And not even Tate himself fully understood why. Or perhaps worse, perhaps he did understand and spent every waking moment trying to keep Noah from understanding too. Andrew's stomach twisted again. Tate's lovers had never been competition for Noah. They had been barriers protecting Noah from the full weight of Tate's attachment. Protecting the truth indirectly. Protecting the hidden structure from scrutiny. And Noah, tragically, interpreted those same barriers as rejection for years. Noah thought Tate could never choose him fully, when the reality was almost unbearable in the opposite direction. Tate's entire emotional world had been organized around Noah so completely that he needed other people surrounding him constantly just to obscure how unnatural that fact truly was. Andrew sat perfectly still at the dining room table, the rain whispering softly against the windows while another realization unfolded inside his mind so slowly and horribly that at first, he tried not to follow it. Because once he followed it fully, the entire narrative surrounding Tate and Noah changed shape again. Not slightly. Completely. For years, Tate had slept on top of Noah like a protective black blanket, snug, warm, and loving without a thought. It was one of Tate's weird traits. He just wanted to be closer to him. Noah didn't know that Tate had only started sleeping on top of Noah after Jay had entered their bedroom late one night. Tate had told Jay to go away and climbed on top of Noah to protect him. This had happened when they were older teenagers before college. Tate was protecting Noah. Noah had woken up just as Jay had left the entryway of the bedroom, leaving the door open. Tate immediately told Noah it was a burglar and to go back to sleep. Noah had believed him. Ever since then, Tate slept on top of Noah to protect him from anyone entering the room. For years, Noah thought it was simply one of Tate's strange little habits. Tate liked being close to him. He liked sleeping beside him, touching him, and feeling the warmth of another person beneath him. Noah never realized that there had been a reason. Tate had made himself the barrier, the protective blanket, the person who would be between Noah and the doorway if someone came into the room again. And somehow, even after all those years had passed, Tate had never stopped doing it. Right before Noah's mother died when Noah was 22, he and Mark had gone off on a cruise. Noah had left a handwritten note telling Tate that he needed some time to transition from college to being back home and that he would be back in a few months. The handwritten note that Noah had left for Tate had gone missing. Tate believed that Noah had left without leaving a note, and when Noah returned, Tate acted like a spurned buddy. He was hurt, confused, and angry, convinced that Noah had simply walked away without saying goodbye. It took many weeks to realize what had happened to the letter. Jay had taken it. During one of Jay's visits to Tate's parents' house, he had walked in and found Tate sleeping alone. Noah was gone. Jay saw the note sitting next to Tate's bedside and took it. He hadn't taken it by accident. Jay had taken the note to tear Noah and Tate apart, to make sure they would be at odds and no longer spend time together, so Jay could win Tate back. By taking Noah's words away from Tate, Jay had created a lie without ever having to tell one. Tate believed Noah had left without saying goodbye. Noah had no idea Tate had never received the note. And while the two of them grew further apart, Jay quietly benefited from the distance he had created. When Tate finally realized months later what had happened, he tried to apologize to Noah about it. But he just couldn't tell Noah where the letter went. He couldn't admit that the note had been taken from him. He couldn't explain that Noah had never abandoned him at all. Noah had written the note. Noah had meant for Tate to have it. Jay had simply made sure Tate never saw it. Andrew had spent years assuming the central emotional love story between Tate and Noah was obvious. Tate loved Noah. Noah loved Tate. Their relationship became distorted by trauma, secrecy, fear, and emotional dependency. Simple. Tragic. Understandable. But now Andrew realized something far more unsettling. The love story was never actually between Tate and Noah. It was between Jay and Tate. Noah interrupted the love story, and according to Jay, the blonde had been an interloper, an uninvited guest, and a nuisance that stayed too long. Noah stood at the center of it emotionally, yes. And Noah unknowingly severed those structures simply by existing inside Tate's emotional world differently than everyone else. Not transactionally. At the time, it all resembled dependency. Now it looked more like survival panic from someone trying desperately not to lose the only relationship in his life untouched by corruption. And perhaps the cruelest part, Noah never understood the scale of what Tate may have sacrificed by choosing him emotionally. Andrew lowered his head slowly. Because if Tate truly diverted himself away from predatory systems, expectations, relationships, or powerful individuals through attachment to Noah, then Noah unknowingly became both Tate's salvation and the catalyst for catastrophic retaliation. Which explained the unbearable contradiction inside Tate perfectly. Why Noah represented safety emotionally while simultaneously representing danger externally. Why Tate loved Noah with terrifying intensity while constantly fearing what proximity to him might cause. Why Tate spent years trying to protect Noah from the truths surrounding Tate's own life. Because Noah interrupted something ancient and poisonous long before he ever understood he had done so. And somewhere deep down, Tate likely believed every terrible thing that happened afterward was his fault for allowing Noah close enough to disrupt the structure in the first place. Not manipulatively. Not strategically. Noah loved Tate sincerely. Messily. Imperfectly. But sincerely. And sincerity was probably the one thing the people surrounding Tate never expected. Andrew eventually understood that Tate's silence wasn't simply about protecting a secret. It was about protecting Noah's entire understanding of his childhood. Tate didn't want Noah to lose his innocence. He didn't want him to look backward at every birthday, every family gathering, every sleepover, every holiday, and wonder which memories had been real and which ones had been built around people who were secretly dangerous. He didn't want Noah to lose his trust in his own judgment. Noah had spent his childhood believing he could read people. He believed he knew who loved him. He believed he could walk into a room and recognize whether he was safe. Tate was terrified that telling him the truth would destroy that confidence. Because what happened when someone learned that some of the people they had loved were monsters? How could Noah ever trust his instincts again? How could he look at an old family photograph without wondering who had been standing beside him? How could he remember childhood affection without questioning whether it had ever been genuine? Tate would rather carry the burden himself than make Noah carry it. In Andrew's mind, that explained the horrifying extremity of Tate's thinking. Tate would rather risk losing everything, even risk Noah's life, than deliberately destroy Noah's understanding of the world by forcing the truth onto him before he was ready. But there was another fear Tate rarely admitted. If Noah ever learned everything, Noah might never look at Tate the same way again. Tate could imagine it too clearly. Noah learning what the Blue family was. Learning what some of Tate's friends and associates had done. Learning what Tate himself had been forced to become in order to survive. Then looking at Tate's face. Not seeing his buddy. Not seeing the person who had protected him. Not seeing the boy who had grown up beside him. Seeing the monster behind the secrets. Tate was terrified that Noah would look into his eyes and be afraid. Maybe Noah would have nightmares. Maybe the sight of Tate's face would become associated with everything horrible he had learned. And Tate couldn't bear that possibility. He could tolerate Noah being angry. He could tolerate Noah hating him. What he couldn't tolerate was Noah being afraid of him. So Tate kept the truth buried. He carried it alone because, in his mind, that was the price of preserving Noah's innocence. Andrew also understood that Talia's discovery would be catastrophic. If Talia ever learned the full truth about the people she had trusted, her entire understanding of her life would collapse. She would have to look back at every person she had welcomed into her home, every person she had trusted around her children, every friendship she had considered genuine, and wonder what she had missed. The woman who had spent her life believing she was surrounded by good people would suddenly discover that some of those people had been monsters. And Tate knew that revelation could destroy her. So he kept carrying it. The secrets. The memories. The fear. The guilt. Everything. Because Tate had convinced himself that there was one thing more important than his own peace of mind. Noah's ability to believe that his childhood had been real. And Andrew finally understood the tragedy. Tate wasn't trying to preserve the lie because he didn't love Noah enough to tell him the truth. He was preserving the lie because he loved Noah so much that he couldn't bear to be the person who shattered the world Noah had spent his entire childhood believing in. Andrew eventually understood that Tate's fear wasn't only about what Noah would learn. It was about what Noah would see afterward. Tate physically resembled many of the men in his family, the same facial structure, similar eyes, similar expressions, features passed down through generations. And some of those men had been monsters. That resemblance had never mattered to Noah before. He had grown up looking at Tate's face without seeing anyone else. To Noah, it was simply Tate. But if Noah learned the truth about the family, Andrew realized that could change. All Noah would have to do was look at Tate. He might recognize pieces of the faces he had seen throughout his childhood. Men he had eaten breakfast beside. Men who had smiled at him across dinner tables. Men he had trusted. Men he had never had any reason to fear. And suddenly, those faces would mean something entirely different. Tate's face could become a reminder of them. Andrew imagined how horrifying that would be for Tate. Noah waking from a nightmare. Opening his eyes. Seeing Tate standing beside his bed. And instead of seeing his buddy, seeing the face of the family members whose secrets had finally been revealed. Tate's face was, in some ways, a younger reflection of those men. That was the last thing Tate wanted. He didn't want Noah looking at him and seeing the Blue family. He wanted Noah to see Tate. The boy who had grown up beside him. The person who had protected him. The person who had stayed in Los Angeles because Noah wouldn't leave. The person who had spent years quietly keeping dangerous people away from him. Tate could tolerate Noah knowing that his family was terrible. What he couldn't tolerate was Noah looking directly at him and wondering whether some part of that darkness lived inside his face. Andrew understood why Tate considered that possibility worse than death. Death would end Tate's suffering. But watching Noah become afraid of his face would mean living every day knowing that the person he had spent his entire life protecting could no longer look at him without seeing the monsters Tate had tried so desperately to keep away from him. Tate didn't want to inherit his family's legacy in Noah's eyes. He didn't want the family resemblance to become evidence of guilt. He didn't want Noah to wake from a nightmare and see a monster where his buddy had always been. And that, Andrew realized, was another reason Tate had remained silent for so long. He wasn't only protecting Noah from the truth. He was protecting Noah's ability to look at him and still see Tate. Andrew exhaled slowly. Noah was not originally part of the game. That was why the system reacted so violently around him. Because Noah represented unpredictability, freedom, authentic attachment. The possibility that Tate might emotionally belong to himself instead of to the hidden structures controlling him. Andrew thought about the years following Noah and Tate growing inseparable. The increasing instability. The secrecy. The pressure. The episodes. The panic whenever Noah pulled away. But Noah himself might never have been the intended destination of the emotional structure surrounding Tate. Andrew's stomach tightened sharply. Noah had interrupted something. That was the thought now forming with terrible clarity. Not maliciously. Not knowingly. But catastrophically. Andrew leaned back slowly, pulse uneven. Because if Tate's childhood had unfolded inside a predatory environment filled with older men competing for access, influence, possession, emotional control, and secrecy, then Tate himself had likely occupied a role long before Noah fully entered the picture. A role Andrew did not even want to define explicitly in his own thoughts. Not because he could not. Because once defined, the implications became unbearable. Tate had not merely been surrounded by predators. He had been valuable to them. Desired. Fought over. Managed. Conditioned. Protected selectively. Possibly groomed emotionally by multiple people simultaneously. Andrew felt sick. And then Noah appeared. Bright. Open. Emotionally sincere. Someone Tate was attached to genuinely outside whatever hidden system previously structured his emotional world. And suddenly the entire balance changed. Noah had not simply become important to Tate. Noah had interrupted access to Tate. That was why everything escalated. Andrew shut his eyes tightly. Jesus Christ. The violence. The secrecy. The emotional instability. The hatred directed toward Noah from certain people over the years has never fully made sense. Andrew always assumed it stemmed from jealousy, scandal, or emotional confusion. Now he wondered if Noah represented something much more threatening. Disruption. Removal. Interference. Because once Tate emotionally bonded with Noah, Tate became harder to control. Harder to isolate. Harder to emotionally possess. And perhaps for the first time in Tate's life, his emotional loyalty belonged genuinely to someone outside the predatory structure surrounding him. Andrew inhaled shakily. That changed everything. Suddenly, the so-called gay hate crime no longer fit cleanly into the narrative Tate originally provided. Andrew had accepted Tate's explanation because it sounded psychologically coherent at the time. A singularly jealous man, an ex-fiancé, and an ex-lover weren't reacting violently to perceived homosexuality in Tate, but because Tate had fallen in love with Noah, which Tate had promised the jealous man he'd never do. Simple. Contained. But now Andrew suspected the attack carried layers Tate himself could barely verbalize safely. Noah may not have merely been collateral damage emotionally. Noah may have been the motive. Not because Noah did something wrong. Because Noah took Tate away. Emotionally. Physically. Psychologically. And if powerful, predatory men had spent years constructing emotional ownership around Tate, then Noah represented catastrophic disruption to that structure. Andrew stared blankly across the dark room. No wonder Tate became obsessed with protecting Noah afterward. No wonder his nervous system treated Noah's vulnerability like life-or-death stakes. Because somewhere inside himself, Tate likely understood something nobody else did. Noah had unknowingly walked into a game already in progress. And by loving Tate back, even imperfectly, Noah had altered the entire structure. Andrew's thoughts spiraled further. That explained another horrifying contradiction, too. Why does Tate simultaneously cling to Noah while trying desperately to keep Noah ignorant? Because Noah did not understand what he interrupted. Did not understand what Tate may have been protecting him from. Did not understand the kind of people emotionally orbiting Tate long before Noah recognized the danger. And Tate likely believed that if Noah ever understood fully, Noah would either run in horror or become psychologically destroyed by the truth. Andrew pressed trembling fingers against the tabletop. The love story, it had started before Noah. That realization chilled him deeply. Somewhere in Tate's past existed emotional dynamics, attachments, possessive structures, coercive bonds, or hidden relationships powerful enough to shape Tate's entire identity long before Noah became central. Noah unknowingly severed those structures simply by existing inside Tate's emotional world differently than everyone else. Not transactionally. Not manipulatively. Not strategically. Noah loved Tate sincerely. Messily. Imperfectly. But sincerely. And sincerity was probably the one thing the people surrounding Tate never expected. Andrew exhaled slowly. Noah was not originally part of the game. That was why the system reacted so violently around him. Because Noah represented unpredictability. Freedom. Authentic attachment. The possibility that Tate might emotionally belong to himself instead of to the hidden structures controlling him couldn't exist in the current climate. Andrew thought about the years following Noah and Tate growing inseparable. The increasing instability. The secrecy. The pressure. The episodes. The panic whenever Noah pulled away. At the time, it all resembled dependency. Now it looked more like survival panic from someone trying desperately not to lose the only relationship in his life untouched by corruption. And perhaps the cruelest part. Noah never understood the scale of what Tate may have sacrificed by choosing him emotionally. Andrew lowered his head slowly. Because if Tate truly diverted himself away from predatory systems, expectations, relationships, or powerful individuals through attachment to Noah, then Noah unknowingly became both Tate's salvation and the catalyst for catastrophic retaliation. Which explained the unbearable contradiction inside Tate perfectly. Why Noah represented safety emotionally while simultaneously representing danger externally. Why Tate loved Noah with terrifying intensity while constantly fearing what proximity to him might cause. Why Tate spent years trying to protect Noah from the truths surrounding Tate's own life. Because Noah interrupted something ancient and poisonous long before he ever understood he had done so. And somewhere deep down, Tate likely believed every terrible thing that happened afterward was his fault for allowing Noah close enough to disrupt the structure in the first place. Years before, Andrew had once spoken with Dr. Miles about the unsettling realization that Tate's persona, his clothing style, vocabulary, sense of humor, body language, even his effortless charisma felt less like authenticity and more like transference. A performance, an imitation of someone else. Yet Andrew could never determine who Tate had been trying to replicate, even though the figure lingering beneath Tate's mannerisms felt strangely familiar, like someone Andrew had met before but could never fully place. And Andrew had been right. He had met the man years earlier at a Blue Household Christmas event the year Noah's mom died. Andrew had shaken his hand, sat beside him at dinner, listened to him speak with effortless confidence, and never once suspected what stood beneath the polished exterior. The man had been trusted implicitly, respected, admired, and welcomed into every room without hesitation. He attended every party, every gathering, every private celebration. One of Terrence's business partners, he also served as Tate's power of attorney, a role that reflected how completely Tate had trusted him. The man had seemed perfect in the eyes of everyone around him. Wealthy, attractive, socially graceful, intelligent, outgoing, warm enough to make strangers feel immediately accepted. Andrew remembered thinking the man carried himself with the kind of ease people spent entire lives trying to imitate. But the illusion shattered the moment Noah entered Tate's life in a way the man could not control. What Andrew had mistaken as Jay's refinement, unusual kindness, and a feeling that made him someone everyone would share secrets with had concealed something monstrous. The man Tate had unknowingly modeled himself after, the man Andrew once believed was wonderful, was, in truth, a rapist, a child molester, a pedophile, and a stalker. Tate had never once witnessed what a healthy relationship looked like. Not in his family, not among the powerful people surrounding him, not in the men he had been taught to admire. Love to Tate had always been tangled with possession, secrecy, fear, and survival. So when he sensed Noah trying to leave him, panic consumed him. He would hold Noah back, plead with him to stay, unable to endure the thought of losing the only person who had ever made him feel human instead of hollow. To outsiders, Tate's behavior looked controlling, ruthless. Even every romantic rival around Noah disappeared from his life. Every manipulative person trying to exploit Noah's kindness somehow lost access to him. But Tate was never trying to monopolize Noah out of ego or dominance. He was terrified, and with good reason. Nearly everyone circling around Noah wanted something from him. Some wanted his innocence, some wanted his vulnerability, and others wanted ownership over the softness Noah carried so naturally. Tate knew exactly what predators looked like because he had spent his entire life surrounded by them. But Tate refused to become one himself. That was why he never told Noah the full truth. If Noah understood why Tate watched people so carefully, why he reacted so violently to threats, why his fear intensified any time Noah disappeared from his sight, then Noah would also understand the darkness Tate had grown up around. Tate could not bear the possibility of Noah looking at him the same way he looked at those other men. Whenever Noah left the physical space around him, Tate's mind spiraled into terror. He imagined Noah cornered, manipulated, broken down the same way Tate had watched happen to countless others. Tate broke objects, destroyed rooms, and lashed out so people would dismiss him as unstable rather than look closely enough to uncover the real reason for his fear. More than anything, Tate wanted isolation. He wanted silence. He wanted a world where nobody could use him anymore. Noah left Tate alone in his environment before Brown made Tate susceptible to rapists and those who protect predators. And that was why Noah's presence became sacred to him. Tate loved Noah's body not out of lust alone, but because it was the only place he had ever truly felt safe. Sleeping beside Noah quieted the violence in his life, and in the bed he used to share with Jay before Noah entered Tate's life. Noah's warmth grounded him in reality, offering the kind of peace Tate had searched for his entire life and never found anywhere else. Tate loved running his fingers through Noah's blonde hair. Of everything Noah possessed, his kindness, his laughter, the softness in his voice, Tate thought the hair was the most beautiful part of him. Those pale golden strands became something sacred in Tate's mind, something gentle enough to rest against his chest when the world around him felt unbearable. Many nights, Noah would fall asleep with his head against Tate, and Tate would quietly comb his fingers through the silky strands for hours, as if the motion itself could calm every fear living inside him. To Tate, Noah's hair represented a kind of innocence he had never associated with men before. The men who had surrounded Tate throughout his life had been cold, dark, predatory figures who carried power like a weapon. Noah was different in every possible way. His blonde hair became symbolic of that difference: softness instead of intimidation, warmth instead of cruelty, safety instead of fear. That was why Tate always loved Noah's long hair. Throughout their childhood, Tate would find excuses to convince Noah not to cut it. Sometimes he would casually mention that it looked better longer. Other times he would complain for days after Noah trimmed it too short. Noah never fully understood why Tate cared so much, but Tate did. Long hair meant Tate could bury his hands in it when anxiety overtook him. It meant he could rest beside Noah and gently toy with the strands while Noah slept peacefully next to him. Those quiet moments became one of the few forms of comfort Tate allowed himself to have. When Tate was 13, he had asked Noah not to cut his hair. Noah had laughed, telling Tate he was ridiculous. Tate had insisted. Eventually, Noah agreed that he wouldn't cut it once his hair went over his eyes. He would let Tate take him to a barber, and Tate would tell the barber how much to take. It had seemed like a harmless compromise at the time. To Tate, however, it had become something much more important. He treated Noah's hair as though it were a sacred agreement between them, a familiar part of Noah that Tate had grown accustomed to seeing and touching. So when Noah eventually cut his hair without him, Tate didn't see it as simply a haircut. He saw it as breaking their agreement. And that, to Tate, was somehow even worse than losing the hair itself. In a life shaped by manipulation, violence, and fear, Noah's hair felt impossibly gentle, and Tate clung to that gentleness like it was the only real thing he had ever known. Andrew swallowed hard, his stomach twisting as the words finally caught up to him. Andrew leaned back in his chair, head in his hands, letting the weight of the truth press down on him. His voice was barely audible, a trembling whisper to no one in particular. He did not speak out loud but internally reasoned about the cause of Tate's psychosis. Definitely not Noah. Jay and Tate's relationship began in NYC, while Jay had taken Tate's virginity because the younger toddler was grateful that Jay had protected him for 2 years before the boy met Noah. The relationship became codependent when Tate became a young teenager in 1981, when Tate was very close to Noah, whose proximity made Jay jealous. Tate was protecting Noah after his 13th birthday from a grown man who had protected Tate for years against the sadistic, coercive abuse Terrence perpetrated against Tate. The teen boy who grew up in Tate's house in NYC became Tate's lover and ex-fiancé and later was the secret predator and stalker who tried to keep Noah away from Tate. The lover Tate protected and hid from the world's eyes was a predator of the most egregious invisible kind. A loved one, a trusted person who had access to Tate's parents' house and could prey on Tate at any time. Something about Noah being in Tate's bed every night brought out intense jealousy and rage in Tate's lover. Tate chose to be the focus of his lover's violence and rage so as not to hurt Noah. Tate had many secrets, they were all connected like a puzzle. If you pulled one, the others were sure to follow. Tate had carefully and congruently created a magic trick that fooled everyone he had ever met, and only Andrew figured out Tate's secret. Noah and Tate needed each other in the same way for the same reason. Of course they did, but not for the reason other adults suspected. But why? Why did Tate always choose Noah? He lifted his head slightly, staring into the empty room as if the walls themselves held the answer. It wasn't just closeness, their relationship, it wasn't able to be labeled. Tate didn't hide his secrets. He made it so obvious that no adult looked beyond Noah because everyone wrongly believed Noah caused the issue and perpetrated the unhealthy relationship between the boys. Noah was really the dam, the lock, the comfort, the reprieve, the symptom of the real problem. Noah's presence was a family gift that kept Tate happy, compliant, and in turn Tate kept his mouth shut. Noah was the blue family pet. He was the incentive Tate needed to do what was expected while acting like everything and everyone was normal. Andrew sat with that realization like it was something heavy pressing on his chest. It finally clicked, not as a rumor, not as fragments, but as a structure that had been there the whole time, invisible until now. Tate hadn't built his closeness with Noah out of accident or convenience. It had a shape, a rule set, an unspoken agreement he seemed to enforce on every level without ever needing to say it twice. A place to land, a place where nothing crossed a certain line, no physical escalation, no sexual ambiguity that ever tipped into reality, just presence, history, and control over the boundary itself. For 24 years, that had been the foundation. And Noah, Andrew realized with a sinking feeling, had been living inside that structure without ever being told what it was. Worse, Noah hadn't just been inside it. He had been pushing against it in ways he didn't even recognize, wanting more closeness without understanding the limits that were already silently set, wanting something reciprocal in a way Tate had never actually allowed the relationship to become. If Tate had publicly announced his love for his buddy Noah, or made it impossible for anyone to misunderstand that Noah was the love of Tate's life, or that he had romantic and sexual feelings for Noah, Jay would have immediately acted. Jay would have violently and swiftly directed every manner of violence and sexual terror toward Tate. Tate knew that. He knew exactly what Jay was capable of, and he knew there would be no warning, no hesitation, and no mercy once Jay understood what Noah truly meant to him. Terrence, on the other hand, would have been different. Terrence would have dug a hole, bashed Noah's head in, and buried him secretly somewhere in the garden. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no public threat, no opportunity for anyone to stop him. Terrence would simply make Noah disappear. Serena was terrified of Terrence. Terrence was a malignant psychopath, a sadist, a murderer, a human trafficker, a rapist, a baby breeder, and an incest perpetrator. He was a man who had turned human beings into commodities and violence into a language of control. Tate, at the age of 4, had made a deal with the devil. Except the devil was his own father. And Tate knew exactly what the terms were. He would never say a word about the sexual, physical, and sadistic violence he had experienced in New York City before meeting Noah. Not one word. He would bury every memory, every wound, every horrifying detail so deeply inside himself that no one would ever know what had happened to him when he was younger. If his father would allow Noah to remain in his life, Tate would keep his mouth shut. That was the bargain. Tate would carry his suffering in silence, and Terrence would allow the young blonde boy Noah to remain in their house. Noah could stay. Noah could eat at their table. Noah could sleep beneath their roof. Noah could remain Tate's buddy. But Noah could never know the truth. That was the one condition Tate could never risk breaking. If Noah even hinted that he had an idea of what was really going on, if he began asking the wrong questions, if he started putting the pieces together, if he ever came close to discovering what Tate had sacrificed to keep him safe, Terrence would murder the boy immediately. Tate knew it. Serena knew it. And somewhere deep down, even before he understood everything, Tate knew that the price of keeping Noah alive was his own silence. So Tate said nothing. He never breathed a word. He allowed Noah to believe that Tate's silences were ordinary, that his nightmares were ordinary, that his fear was ordinary, that there were simply parts of his past he didn't want to discuss. But they weren't ordinary. None of it was. Tate had made a deal with his own father to protect the person he loved most, and the cruelest part of the bargain was that Noah could never be allowed to understand just how much Tate had sacrificed for him. Andrew remembered how Susie had yelled at Tate for not showing any feeling for his own father when Terrence died. Andrew couldn't stop thinking about how cruelly backward that had been. Imagine one of your best friends yelling at you because you wouldn't show emotion or grief for the man who had held a gun to your head your entire life. The man who had hung you from a ceiling fan. The man who had threatened the boy you slept next to and forced you to hide in your godfather's bed for protection because your own father enjoyed terrorizing you. Terrence got his jollies from making a boy so terrified that he would have seizures. Terrence was the reason Tate showed no emotion besides anger. Andrew understood that now. Terrence hadn't simply punished Tate for being emotional, he had systematically taught him that emotion itself was dangerous. Any emotional outburst that wasn't fury Terrence considered feminine. Sadness was weakness, fear was weakness, tears were weakness, affection was weakness. And Terrence was a homophobe. He had threatened to castrate his own son if Tate ever showed any inclination toward homosexuality. Terrence had convinced himself that he could cure his son of being gay after the school dance, when Tate had been caught with a girl in the closet at school. Terrence had made it very clear that if Tate ever did anything sexual with Noah or with any other boy, Terrence would have no problem killing his own son. Terrence had straightened his own son out. At least that was what Terrence told himself. He had told Tate never to be anything but straight. Never to show affection toward another boy. Never to let himself be vulnerable. Never to give Terrence a reason to believe there was anything different about him. And then, years later, Susie had stood there and demanded to know why Tate wasn't grieving his father. Andrew wanted to ask her what exactly she expected grief to look like when the dead man had spent his entire life teaching his son that love was something to fear. Tate wasn't emotionless because Terrence's death meant nothing to him. Tate was emotionless because Terrence had spent years beating the emotion out of him. And Andrew finally understood that those were two completely different things. The contradiction was what made it so unstable. Tate his relationship with Noah to stay in one shape, safe, contained, predictable. Noah kept wanting it to become something else entirely without realizing he was asking for a version of Tate that the Blue Air had explicitly built walls against. And the most dangerous part wasn't even the mismatch. It was that Noah had no idea the rules existed at all. Noah and Tate's relationship was an exact reflection of hell, an identical copy of something else. It was a mirror image, a smokescreen, a cover for secrets and an awful, unimaginable reality Tate lived every day, a reflection that only the wise recognized. Everything about Noah and Tate's relationship was an identical mirror image that exposed everything Tate wouldn't or couldn't divulge. Noah was the blackmail Tate used against the right people to keep the blonde close and use Noah's body to protect himself. Every toxic behavior and physical demonstration of Tate's affection for Noah was behavior Tate had received personally from a lover. Tate didn't understand what a healthy relationship with boundaries looked like, which is why Tate would follow Noah into bed even when the blonde friend didn't want him to. The possessive, jealous, controlling, childlike, violent, angry, boundary-pushing, intimacy-demanding, agency-limiting, secretive, rage-filled qualities of Tate weren't original but a performance he observed in his toxic lover Jay and copied. This was why Tate smiled when anyone asked about his relationship with Noah, because he was so brilliant and clever that no one figured it out. Their relationship was not conventional. Everyone thought it was unnatural. These adults didn't know what unnatural love really was. If they did, no one would attribute that word to the beautiful, complex love of Noah and Tate. It was unnatural, but that was the key. Tate treated Noah the only way he knew because Tate was also a Noah himself and Noah would have been a Tate, but Tate didn't and wouldn't allow it. Tate had a secret, illicit relationship on the side for decades and no one ever suspected. Andrew noticed Tate at Brown. Tate was charismatic, materialistic, hedonistic, and hypersexualized. He asked Noah and Susie questions about Tate since those friends had known Tate for years. Tate wore sunglasses and sexualized clothing. He did reckless, dangerous, and unexplainable things. He shouted things off roofs that weren't acceptable in the 1980s because Tate had nothing to fear except being alone. Tate acted spoiled and cold to hide the damage of an exploited teenager. Talia had admitted that Tate had fucked hundreds of women and acted as though they were disposable garbage, something forgettable. But now he seemed to view Noah as something worth preserving or repeating. What Noah didn't know, and no one suspected, wasn't that Tate kept Noah close because he chose to. It was because Noah was the smoking gun, the actual gun Tate protected himself with every day. The distraction so no one would notice Jay or his relationship with Tate. Noah was the reason why Tate had run across town to apologize and get Noah back, because it was imperative that Noah's body be in that house every second of the day due to Noah being the witness that prevented escalation of the worst kind. Tate viewed Noah, even when they met, as something sacred that no one dared to interfere with or interlope within, would not allow any competition because Tate was suffering from transference. Like his lover, Tate would not let Noah leave him for any reason, even if he had to resort to violence, threats, or orders to keep Noah close. Someone had done the same thing to Tate and wouldn't let him have friends or romantic interests, and Tate mirrored this behavior onto Noah. Tate and Noah's relationship wasn't a duo but a secret trio. It was an exact copy of the love that dare not speak its name, but that love wasn't about Noah or Tate. Nobody but Tate's secret lover could ever fill that role, the role Noah mirrored every day. This was why Tate fell in love with Noah years ago, the reason why Tate worshipped Noah as his hero and idol, and why the two boys were too close and inseparable. Andrew smiled. Noah had no idea that the behavior Tate showed towards his friend convinced Andrew he wasn't wrong. Noah had been an escape, an opportunity for Tate to flee from a situation Noah could never discover. Noah had been the other woman, a member of a toxic love triangle that had started before Noah met Tate and well after these boys were buddies. Two people were in a power struggle, a fight for Tate's attentions and affections. Noah was the only person within the triangle to be unaware of its existence or of everyone involved. Noah hadn't an idea in hell what reality really was for Tate. Noah was serious competition for Tate's attention, affections, love, and proximity. Noah had stolen Tate away emotionally and physically from someone else, and Tate had played innocent and ignorant the entire time to protect Noah. Tate reset the room so no one would ever know his secret or ask a question about Tate's lover that he couldn't answer, especially why Tate met Noah or why Tate loved the blonde. Noah and anyone in Tate's life didn't know that the older teen, Tate Blue, had a jealous, possessive, manipulative, dangerous, violent, sociopathic, and cunning lover who hated the sight of Noah, knew the truth of Tate's love for his buddy, resented Noah's presence in Tate's life in bed, and was capable of anything to get what they wanted. This jealous, territorial lover would stop at nothing to make Noah disappear or force Tate to reject choosing Noah by frequent threatening voiceless phone calls. Andrew eventually understood that Jay couldn't get back at Tate directly. So Jay went after Noah. It wasn't really about Noah, not in the way everyone assumed. Jay wanted to terrify Tate. He would get close to Noah, deliberately invading his space, rubbing up against him emotionally and physically in ways that Tate couldn't ignore. Jay knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to rile Tate up. He wanted Tate frightened enough to believe that the only way to make it stop was to give Jay what he wanted. Jay wanted his ex-lover back. He wanted Tate to restart their relationship, so Jay would leave Noah alone. And that was the part Andrew believed everyone kept getting wrong. Tate wasn't jealous of the man Noah was close to. He was terrified of him. Tate knew Jay. He knew how Jay thought, how he manipulated people, and how far he was willing to go when he didn't get what he wanted. Jay wasn't simply pursuing Noah because he had developed feelings for him. Jay was using Noah to provoke Tate. Every interaction carried the same unspoken message. Come back to me and I'll leave him alone. Tate understood the threat even when nobody else did. To everyone watching, Tate might have looked possessive, jealous, angry that another man was getting close to Noah. Andrew knew better. Tate wasn't afraid that Jay would steal Noah's affection. Tate was afraid that Jay would use Noah to punish him. That distinction changed everything. Jay had found Tate's greatest vulnerability and turned it into leverage. Noah was the person Tate loved most, and Jay knew it. If Jay couldn't hurt Tate directly, he could threaten the person Tate would do anything to protect. It was coercion disguised as romance. Jay was effectively forcing Tate into a choice he should never have had to make: surrender himself to his former lover or risk Jay escalating his pursuit of Noah. And Tate knew exactly what Jay wanted. Jay didn't want Noah. Jay wanted Tate. Noah was simply the weapon Jay had chosen to use to get him back. Everything was backwards. Noah thought that men were trying to steal Noah away from Tate, but it was really the other way around. Jay was trying to steal Tate away from Noah. And Noah didn't see it. He couldn't. He didn't know that Jay was Tate's ex-lover. He didn't know that Tate wasn't jealous of Jay or afraid that Jay would take Noah away from him. Tate was terrified that Jay or any man would succeed in getting Tate back. That was the truth Noah couldn't see. What was even more terrifying was that Jay wasn't the only person Noah trusted so completely. Terrence and many of the other men in Noah's life were people Noah worshipped and saw almost as gods. And Noah worshipped Jay just as much. Jay could have taken Noah anywhere, and Noah would have followed him. Noah wouldn't have known that he was being taken to his death. He wouldn't have known that he was going to disappear without a trace. He would have trusted Jay until the very end, and by the time Jay put his arms around Noah's throat, it would already be too late. Everything Noah thought he understood was backwards. He thought Tate was afraid of losing him. The truth was that Tate was afraid of losing himself, and of losing Noah to the men who had spent years trying to control them both. Jay succeeded in two very specific ways, and both of them brought him dangerously close to getting Tate to restart their relationship so that Jay could stop his emotional grooming of Noah. The first was simple enough to understand. Jay repeatedly tried to get Noah into his car, offering to take him to another location. Several times, Tate stopped it before Noah could go with him. Tate knew that if Noah got into Jay's car, he might be taken somewhere Tate couldn't reach him. But Jay eventually found another way to get close to Noah. He became emotionally close to him. Jay positioned himself as one of Noah's confidants. He became someone Noah trusted, someone Noah could talk to about Tate and about the complicated relationship between Tate and Noah. That emotional tether infuriated Tate. Not because Tate was jealous. Because Tate understood what Jay was doing. Jay was grooming Noah emotionally. The terrifying part was that Jay would never have physically hurt Noah. Jay loved the little blonde boy. Tate knew that. Jay could be cruel, manipulative, and frightening, but Noah was different. Jay cared about him and would never intentionally inflict physical harm on him. So Jay found another way to control Noah. He controlled what Noah thought. He became the person Noah could confide in about Tate, slowly influencing how Noah interpreted Tate's behavior, Tate's feelings, and their relationship. And that was what terrified Tate most. Jay didn't need to hurt Noah physically. If Jay could convince Noah that Tate didn't truly love him, that Tate was unreliable, or that Tate was the source of all their problems, then Jay could accomplish something far more effective. He could separate Noah from Tate without ever laying a hand on him. Tate could fight a physical threat. He could stop Noah from getting into Jay's car. He could pull Noah away from a dangerous situation. But how was Tate supposed to fight someone who had already gotten inside Noah's head? That was the battle Tate was losing. Jay had become one of Noah's confidants, and Tate knew exactly what that meant. Every secret Noah told Jay about the blonde's feelings and relationship with Jay's godson became another piece of leverage. Noah didn't know that Jay was Tate's godfather. He knew him as someone else, and unfortunately for Noah, the blonde had told Tate's jealous ex-lover everything Noah felt and wanted from Tate, which made Jay isolate and try to drive a wedge between the two young boys. Every doubt Jay planted became another thread tying Noah emotionally to him. And every time Noah trusted Jay over Tate, Tate became more terrified that Jay was succeeding. Jay didn't have to steal Noah away physically. He only had to convince Noah to walk away from Tate on his own. Whenever Mark started sniffing around Noah, Tate reacted like something sharp snapping into place, vindictive, jealous, almost frightening in the intensity of it. He didn't frame it as insecurity or emotion. He framed it as protection, as ownership, as a necessity. Andrew could see it now as a mirrored pattern, two reflections of the same distorted image, one feeding the other. Tate's reactions weren't original, they were learned, they were inherited. And the origin of it all, Andrew realized, went further back than either of them had ever questioned. Tate had been taught explicitly, repeatedly, that this was what love looked like. This is how people act when they care about somebody. It had been said like a rule, not an opinion, like a definition of something universal rather than a behavior shaped by damage. So when Tate felt jealousy, it didn't register as something to examine or question. It registered as proof that he cared correctly, proof that intensity equaled truth. So when Mark circled Noah, Tate didn't pause to evaluate whether his reaction was healthy or appropriate. He escalated, because escalation in his internal logic was sincerity. And Andrew could see the cruel symmetry in it now. Tate's jealous, possessive reactions weren't just about Noah, they were a reenactment of what he had been shown by Jay, a script he never agreed to write but had been handed anyway. The tragedy wasn't just that Tate believed it. It was that he had no framework to recognize that there was any other way to feel. Tate had told Noah years before something that Tate had told him in bed. He fell in love first, and a boy in love, turned in the opposite direction, met you, then fell again, deeper in love. Tate was already in love with his lover before Noah appeared in Tate's life. Tate met Noah and fell in love with a second person. Unfortunately, the he Tate mentioned, Noah misunderstood as Tate and not Tate's lover. When Tate was jealous and possessive of Noah making friends, Tate didn't realize this was unhealthy behavior because Jay had demonstrated the same behavior when Tate had become close as a teen with Noah. Andrew had believed since the first dissociation episode, when Tate admitted the warehouse incident, that Tate had had an inappropriate relationship when he was a teenager with an adult, which Andrew wrongly assumed had been a teacher or an authority figure near Noah. That warehouse memory was about a violent, jealous confrontation Tate weathered with his lover when he was an adult. The gun, the blood, how Tate was screaming in agony in front of Susie. Tate must have pissed someone off big time, and Tate was tortured, threatened, and strangled almost to death. Tate's ex-fiancée hurt Tate for repeatedly choosing Noah and refusing to abandon the blonde for an inappropriate relationship with that older man. Now, Andrew knew it wasn't just torture but sex of a much darker taboo theme than he ever could have dreamed. What kind of sex would make Tate scream like that? Tate was in agony as if his soul was leaving his body. Tate acted as if the sex was egregious, vile, abhorrent, and taboo. Within a year, Tate had abandoned Noah because of Noah's supposed BPD betrayal or his interest in marrying Chloe. What if Tate didn't have an option to stay? Maybe somebody's gun gave Tate no choice but to leave in the middle of the night. Tate was probably using the BPD betrayal as a cover, or reason to leave. Tate had leaped out of Susie's truck and bolted like the devil was after him. Tate was probably fleeing from his lover, who wanted to hurt or possibly kill him because Noah still existed around Tate, or Terrence threatened to kill Noah for preventing his desire for the blue heir to marry. Tate didn't see Susie's face before his episode at his house. He saw his lover, who wouldn't let Tate go even after all this time. Andrew remembered something he had asked Tate on their drive to Chloe's months ago. Andrew remembered what Tate had said at the Blue Warehouse weeks before today. Was he mad? Yes, Tate had confirmed. I'm glad people get angry when they don't get what they want, Tate, Andrew remembered. Tate protecting Noah from bullies as a teen was a parallel for something much darker. Noah protected Tate from too many monsters and a bully, a violent ex-lover too powerful and invisible for Tate to fight against. Noah and Tate were being constantly watched by Jay, Terrence. Many predators, just like how Tate watched Noah around Mark, and Tate wouldn't risk Noah spending 1 second out of his sight where Tate wouldn't have the ability to protect his buddy. This was why Tate turned down dates or sports so he could protect Noah from danger. The danger was why Tate slept next to Noah. Why Tate refused to sleep alone. Andrew didn't arrive at the conclusion all at once. It came slowly, piece by piece, the way most truths did when you watch people long enough. At first, it had simply been another odd detail in the strange orbit that existed between Tate and Noah. People thought Tate would not let Noah sleep alone. Andrew laughed. It was actually the other way round. Adults thought that Noah was corrupting Tate due to Noah's feminine behavior, but Tate's lover was corrupting and defiling Tate. The real reason was so much darker and more disgusting than Andrew could admit even to himself. Tate was the one who could not sleep alone. It was imperative that Tate never sleep alone for any reason. There was no way under heaven Tate could sleep alone, and if that meant dragging the unwilling blonde down the hall or breaking through Noah's door to find a place to hide, so be it. Tate knew what would happen if he slept alone, and if he had to break all boundaries and lines of decency, he would to prevent rape. He could never tell Noah why they slept together on Tate's bed because Noah's life depended on never suspecting the real reason. Tate knew what would happen if Noah slept on the floor or slept down the hall. Wayne was a perfect example of what could happen if Tate wasn't the smartest person in the room, the cleverest, the man 3 steps ahead of everyone including Noah. Noah thought Tate was manipulative, but actually Tate was clever, so clever that not one adult in 30 years ever suspected or had a clue. They thought they knew Tate like the back of their hand. They hadn't a clue, and the sad part was that Noah spent half of his life wanting Tate to love him back. And Noah didn't know why Tate couldn't, because if Tate actually loved Noah back, or openly, the way Noah loved Tate, Noah would probably get shot or buried under the family garden. For many months before Tate's move to Brown, he had spent nights in the hallway, leaning up against Noah's spare room door, sleeping because the blonde wouldn't let him in due to them growing apart before college. Noah had talked about Tate and his relationship because his peer group couldn't figure them out. Noah had laughed about it more than once, usually when the others were sitting around the table late at night. It wasn't just that. It was imperative that Noah didn't sleep alone, but primarily, Tate could not, under any circumstances, sleep alone with the door unlocked. If Noah were in the spare room, the safest place to sleep in that house would be on Noah's door, protecting them both. The details make Tate's behavior read less like ordinary protectiveness and more like a child who has learned to turn his own body into a physical barrier. Because every adult in his parents' household had keys to the doors, including Tate, a locked bedroom door couldn't guarantee Noah's safety. Tate understood that. That's why he slept directly against Noah's door. If anyone tried to enter Noah's room at night, they would have to get past Tate first. His head was propped against the wooden door, so when the door moved, Tate would immediately fall backward and wake up. It was an awkward arrangement, but Tate preferred being uncomfortable to leaving Noah's doorway unguarded. And when Uncle Joey wasn't there, Tate felt even more responsible for protecting Noah. Joey's intimidating presence had always provided another layer of protection. When Joey was absent, Tate tried to become that protection himself. After Noah returned from house-sitting following high school graduation, Tate went even further. He broke the hinges on Noah's window so it could no longer be opened. If someone attempted to climb through the window, they wouldn't be able to push it open. That left only one practical way into Noah's bedroom at night, through the door. And that meant getting past Tate. Ironically, several people who attempted to enter Noah's room silently on the 3rd floor discovered exactly how effective Tate's improvised security system was. They tripped over him. More than once. Tate would wake up sprawled across the hallway floor, startled and irritated, while the person who had been trying to sneak into Noah's room stood there wondering how they had managed to trip over a human being who was practically part of the architecture. Tate didn't care how ridiculous it looked. He had decided that if someone wanted to reach Noah in the middle of the night, they were going to have to get through him first. "I swear," Noah had said once to Susie, shaking his head, "if I try to sleep in my own room, Tate either drags me back to his bed or parks himself outside my door like some kind of ardent admirer." Everyone had laughed. Everyone except Andrew. Because the behavior hadn't sounded romantic to him, it hadn't even sounded jealous in the normal sense. It sounded structured, intentional. Over time, Andrew had collected the details the way he always did, quietly, without drawing attention to it. Even at Brown University when they were in college, Tate's protectiveness followed them. After the Tina incident, Noah had moved to a new dorm room. Tate responded in the only way that made sense to him. He slept outside Noah's bedroom door. It didn't take long for the entire campus to start talking. Students whispered about the wealthy young man who slept in the hallway outside another student's room. People speculated. Rumors spread through the dorms until the situation eventually became serious enough that Noah had to meet with the dean, but Tate didn't care about the gossip. To him, the hallway wasn't embarrassing. It was a position. Tate believed Noah was safest when Tate was directly outside his door, where he could prevent anyone from getting inside. It wasn't only frat boys Tate worried about. It was anyone. Strangers, predators, people who might take advantage of Noah, even members of Tate's own family. Tate had spent too much of his life learning that danger didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it came from people who were supposed to be trusted. So Tate slept against Noah's door. It was the second best place he could possibly be. The safest place Tate believed was beside Noah. If they slept together, Tate could wake immediately if anything happened. He could see Noah, hear him, know that he was safe. But if they couldn't sleep together, Tate would take the next best position. Outside the door. Between Noah and anyone who might try to reach him. The rest of the campus saw something strange. Noah saw something embarrassing. The dean saw something that needed explaining. Tate saw a barricade. As long as his body was between Noah and the door couldn't open without waking him. And for Tate, that was enough. On the day Tate married Chloe against his own will, Tate had called Noah anonymously and played home movies over the telephone, one of those old family time reels. There was a segment where Tate was watching Noah sleeping in his room. Someone had opened the door and come inside. What no one realized was that it had been Jay. Tate had immediately told the man to leave. Noah didn't know what he was listening to. He couldn't see what was happening on the other end of the telephone. All he could hear was the faint recording and suddenly the unmistakable squeak of Tate's bedroom door. That squeak was deliberate. Tate had never oiled the hinges. Any time the door to his bedroom opened, it made an unmistakably loud, shrill sound. Tate had kept it that way on purpose. There was no way anyone could cross the threshold without him hearing it. It was another part of the security system Tate had built around himself and Noah. The squeaking door was an alarm. If someone crossed that threshold at night, Tate would wake immediately. And if anyone came close to Noah, Tate was prepared to defend him with a gun. He wouldn't have cared who it was. Anyone who entered that room intending to hurt Noah would have been treated as a threat. Anyone except Jay. Tate wouldn't shoot his former fiancée. Even after everything that had happened between them, Jay was different in Tate's mind. If Jay entered the room, Tate would simply tell him to get out. Firmly. Immediately. But he would not pull the trigger. Noah, listening anonymously from the other end of the telephone, could hear none of the thoughts behind that recording. He only heard the squeaking door. He didn't know that Tate had deliberately preserved that sound for years. He didn't know that it was an alarm. And he certainly didn't know that. Even on the day Tate was being forced into a marriage he didn't want, Tate was still thinking about keeping Noah safe. Tate had entered Noah's house several times both before and after he married Chloe. Tate had set up the security footage himself. He knew where the security box was and he knew how to erase the footage. He had also put a timer on the security box that recorded everything, allowing Tate enough time to walk out the door before it started recording again. Tate had left the gun on the kitchen table because Terrence was still alive, and so were several of the predators in his family. If any of these men entered Noah's property with the intention of harming him, they would be recorded. Nobody could enter Noah's bedroom without being videotaped. The room where Tate kept the security footage was secret. Only Tate and Noah knew about it. No one else knew where it was, and the cameras were almost invisible. Tate had set up the security cameras because Jay had walked onto the property several months before Tate installed them. Tate knew Jay had been inside the Rambler because he smelled Jay's cologne. Tate lied to Noah about the cologne he wore. Tate had started wearing Jay's particular cologne himself to cover up Jay being around him while having sex. Tate wore the same cologne as Jay so Noah would never guess that another man had been close enough to Tate for his cologne to transfer onto Tate's body. It would have been pretty hard for an 8-year-old boy to explain away why his body smelled like another man the family knew, so Tate created an explanation before Noah could ever ask the question. If Noah smelled Jay's cologne on Tate, he would simply assume it was Tate's. Only Tate and Noah knew the truth about the security room. And Tate intended to keep it that way. Tate required Noah to sleep in his bed every night. If Noah insisted on sleeping in the spare room, Tate would lie down directly against the door, his back pressed to it as if he were physically blocking the entrance. Andrew thought back to the 2 rules Noah had mentioned Tate had for their relationship. You sleep in bed with me and you spend your days with me. Both actions Tate required of Noah. Tate needed Noah to never leave Tate's side. At the time, it had seemed ridiculous, dramatic, another example of Tate's overwhelming personality. But Andrew had noticed something else too. Noah had once mentioned, almost casually, that Tate's pulse sometimes went wild in the middle of the night. For no reason, Noah had said, confused, he'll just suddenly tense up like he heard something. Andrew remembered that comment very clearly, because people's bodies rarely reacted for no reason, which meant Tate believed there was a reason, and it terrified the fuck out of the boy. Andrew leaned back in his chair now, letting the final pieces settle into place. The reason Tate would not let Noah sleep alone, why Tate insisted Noah stay in his bed every night, why he sometimes positioned himself like a human barricade outside Noah's door, it suddenly seemed much simpler than everyone had assumed. If Noah was next to Tate in bed, then Tate's lover or family couldn't visit Tate's bed. Couldn't slip into the room unnoticed. Couldn't slide beneath the covers. Andrew felt a quiet chill run through him as the implication expanded. Because that meant Tate wasn't trying to keep Noah close out of affection alone. He was controlling the environment. If Noah were beside him, Tate would know instantly if anyone opened the door, the hinges would loudly squeak. If Noah slept somewhere else, then the hallway became dangerous. Which explained the nights Tate slept directly against Noah's door. Not touching him, not sharing the room. Blocking the entrance. It wasn't romantic. It was defensive. This is why, when Noah tried to leave the blue house, move out, or sleep alone, Tate ran across town or forced his body into whatever bed Noah was sleeping in because Tate was terrified of something worse than crossing Noah's boundaries. He was terrified of being alone or, worse, that Noah would be alone and vulnerable to predators. A desperate attempt by a teenager to create a barrier between 2 people. Andrew closed his eyes briefly as the final thought settled. Tate's pulse racing at night suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't dreaming. He was listening. Listening for the sound of a door handle turning. For footsteps in the hallway, for the quiet shift of someone entering the room. Tate wasn't afraid of losing Noah's attention. He was afraid of something far worse, afraid his lover or father would walk through that door and demand sex. And if that happened while Noah slept somewhere else in the houses they shared, vulnerable and unaware. Andrew exhaled slowly. Tate slept with a cocked gun by his bedside during Noah's absence after the blonde moved out 2 weeks before graduation. Tate trashed his house because he was too terrified to sleep alone. Lying against Noah's door or on top of Noah's body wasn't just an act of devotion. It was a last line of defense. A silent, desperate strategy from a boy who believed that if he didn't physically place himself between them, Noah might not wake up the next morning. And the most unsettling part of the entire realization was this. Tate had never told Noah any of it. He had simply stayed awake at night, pulse racing, body tense, guarding the door. Making sure that if his lover ever came looking for him again, they would have to go through Noah first or Tate's body blocking Noah's room. When Tate told his mom, "I would do anything to protect Noah, even commit self-defense," this was what Tate had hinted at. The felony Tate had admitted he committed was why Tate was screaming during his seizure. The felony was his lover finding Tate alone or gaining access to Noah's bed. What makes this especially tragic is that 7-year-old Tate wouldn't have had the understanding or power to interpret what was happening as an adult would. He could have focused entirely on one thing, keeping Noah from seeing it. Tate's fear wasn't necessarily about himself. He was terrified that Noah might wake up and discover something he wasn't supposed to know. If Noah had been nearby while Jay was abusing Tate, Tate understood that everything could change. Noah might see Jay differently. He might see Tate differently. Most dangerously, he might realize what Terrence was allowing to happen. And Tate knew what Terrence did to children who knew too much. If Noah hadn't been in the car, Tate might not have worried about what happened to him personally. At 7, he could have regarded his own suffering as something he simply had to endure, but Noah was different. Noah was his buddy. Tate didn't want Noah's innocence destroyed by witnessing something he couldn't possibly understand. He didn't want Noah to wake up and see Jay hurting him. He didn't want Noah to ask questions. And above all, he didn't want Terrence to discover that Noah knew. Because Tate understood the rule that governed their household: children who learned things they weren't supposed to know were in danger. So even as a little boy, Tate learned to protect Noah by hiding what was happening to himself. That was one of the earliest ways Tate became Noah's protector, by making his own suffering invisible. Tate, while in the garage an hour ago, had said the name of his lover, begging the guy to stop squeezing his throat during sex, and Andrew pieced the story of the gun and memory together. The lover who threatened Tate's life with a gun at the warehouse was driving the car with both boys inside when Tate jerked the wheel to prevent his unwanted sexual attentions. The guy must have been groping Tate's thigh and clothed dick, while Noah slept in the front passenger seat in Jay's car. If Noah were awake, his lover couldn't hurt Tate. He wondered if Tate abandoning Noah to marry Chloe was due to a certain betrayal involving a lover that Tate endured as a teen that made Tate too terrified to stay with Noah. He suspected Tate's lover was a gay man who wouldn't let Tate choose anyone but him, especially Noah, to be in a relationship with. Tate abandoning Noah probably saved the blonde boy's life. Susie, crouched silently a few feet away, felt the weight of his words press down like a physical force. Andrew realized now why Tate's obsession with Noah had always seemed impenetrable, why his protectiveness had been absolute, why every breakdown and dissociative episode somehow revolved around him. Noah was the only place Tate knew where sex didn't exist, and the body he slept by didn't want to fuck him. Andrew's hands shook slightly as he pressed them to his face again. I see it. I see everything now, every choice, every episode, every moment of panic. It all makes sense, their relationship. It couldn't be labeled, that's why. That's why no one could ever understand them or come between these two, and that's why Tate will always choose Noah. Tate had to choose Noah because his body was vulnerable in bed if Noah was elsewhere. This was why Tate begged Noah for forgiveness first or snuck into Noah's bed for years. Tate loved Noah's body because that body protected Tate against rape and nightly bodily assaults. Andrew walked into Tate's bedroom and stared at the twin bed, too small for sex. The size was perfect, so lovers would stay away. Andrew stood in the bedroom for a while before walking to the spare room that used to be Noah's bedroom. Andrew looked at Noah's door and all the evidence Talia had divulged. The small bathroom on the 3rd floor where Jay attacked Tate at 15, the same floor as Tate's bedroom and Noah's spare bedroom, didn't have a toilet, just a shower which didn't match the info Talia, Tate's mother, told him. There was no reason for any adult at night to walk past Tate's or the spare room door because the rooms were at the end of the hallway, and no bathroom existed with a toilet on the 3rd floor. Anyone who walked near the spare door where Noah slept wanted to slip unnoticed into the guest room to prey on the slumbering little boy.